We're very pleased today to have Johannes and the discussion. So yeah, Johannes and Richard are here with us from the fund, and transparency is one of those golden words in development. It's impossible to be against it. It's like accountability. You only have to put it into a report, and it's intrinsically correct. But there's a lot more work going on to try and get below that sort of golden headline with transparency right now. And certainly on the fiscal side, then there's been tremendous step forward. The bank have updated their code, which I think, Richard, I think this is what you're giving out right now.
A working draft, yes. There's a sneak preview.
Ah, goodness, okay. This will be worth a fortune on eBay in years to come. You might sign them as you distribute.
No, if you try and scan it, it'll just say void across the
So yeah, the bank are updating their fiscal transparency code, and at the same time are bringing in a revised ROS, a new fiscal transparency assessment, which I think it's fair to say, but I'm obviously your presentation will correct me if this is the wrong way to frame it. Really assesses compliance with the code, and this is a forerunner of some comments that we might be making subsequently in terms of the sort of empirical underpinnings of some of it. So Johannes and Richard will present both the code and also the assessment tool to us, and I think we've got some early examples of its application to discuss with some very interesting countries. And then subsequently we'll hear as discussants, we'll hear from Bob Beschel, who was lead public specialist in the Anchor and head of our governance and public accountability cluster, and Stuti Khemani, who's been doing a lot of work as senior economist in the research department in DEC, looking at the impact of transparency and the degree to which it actually changes behaviour and improves performance, particularly at the local level. So if we could begin with the presentation, just give me some idea, how long do you want to need for the presentation?
20-25 minutes.
That would be absolutely perfect. I was asked, by the way, and I've already forgotten, I was asked to remind people to turn off their phones. Apparently we are being recorded, so future generations will be distressed if the recordings are interrupted by phones going off. So your names will be noted. So I think, who's going to begin? Johannes, thanks very much.
Well, Nick, thanks a lot for this opportunity that you're giving to us, to Richard and me, to give everybody here at the bank an update of our work on the new fiscal transparency code and assessment. And I want to say at the beginning that this is work in progress, and so it's still a very good opportunity for also the bank to provide some inputs, and we are very much looking forward to hopefully a lively discussion. Especially also in light of the fact that we have just completed 2 of our pilots, one to Ireland, which Richard led, and one to Costa Rica. And we have a 3rd pilot going on as we speak in Bolivia, so 3 very different countries. And so far I think the experience has been good, but we will make some adjustments, and what we have distributed already is the draft of the new code as it is right now, but it will not be the final code that we are going to present to our board hopefully later this year. In our presentation we are going to talk first of all about the motivation of why we think it is necessary to revise the fiscal transparency code, and this is directly related to the global crisis, 2008-2009 global crisis that brought to the fore some problems that many of us thought were impossible even in advanced economies, and that clearly also pointed to the need to revise the fiscal transparency code. And this is the second part of the presentation. And then in the third part we will present to you how the new transparency assessment is looking like right now. And this will then also draw on the experiences of Ireland and Costa Rica. If we go back a little bit to history, it's always good to start with history. The origins of the global fiscal transparency effort were in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. And this crisis highlighted the weaknesses in public and private financial reporting, and it also underscored the risks associated with undisclosed linkages between the two. And as a result of this analysis, new fiscal reporting standards were developed, and we are listing the most important ones here. First of all, the IMF's Code and Manual on Fiscal Transparency. Then in the area of statistics, the EU's ESA 95, the GFSM 2001, and the United Nations SNA 2008. And in the accounting area, the IPSAS. There were also quite a few efforts to develop new tools for monitoring compliance with the standards. And we have, for instance, at the IMF, the GDDS, the General Data Dissemination Standard, and the Special Data Dissemination Standard. We have the Fiscal and Data ROSCs, and we have the PIFA. And these instruments have been used quite extensively. For instance, we at the IMF, we have done about 111, exactly 111, fiscal ROS under the old format. And in the PIFA, we have Phil here from the PIFA Secretariat. There were more than 300 PIFA assessments that have been done over the last 8 years or so. At the regional level, we have various efforts from Eurostat, or if we look in certain regions of the world, in West Africa or in Central Africa, the harmonization efforts with respect to fiscal reporting. And then many of you are probably familiar with the Open Budget Survey and Index, which has ranked also, I think, more than 100 countries with respect to their budget practices. Now, if we look at the progress that has been achieved over the last decade, one can note some progress, but certain areas still don't give us a feeling that progress has been satisfactory, and I will go through it one by one. If we begin with the institutional coverage, we can state that there has been an increase of the coverage in terms of the general government, going up from 48 countries to 78 countries within just a 7-year period. At the same time, there's still quite a few countries that have remained at the central government level or have not reported data at all to the IMF. I think there's quite a lot of potential there to still enhance the coverage with respect to fiscal reporting. If we move to the right-hand panel, which shows the shift from cash to accrual, which is underway, we also note some progress. If you take partial and full accrual together, there's been an increase from 38 countries to 64 countries. But many countries in the world, 120, still are in the cash world, which means that you do not capture the emergence of arrears that easily. If we go down now to the third panel, there the progress has been even more limited. Many countries still do not publish a balance sheet, 126 countries, whereas the efforts by countries to publish financial and non-financial assets. So now what are you going to do?
Just watch. Just watch. These are all the cameras swung around.
So the number of countries that are publishing financial and non-financial assets has remained pretty low, slightly more than a dozen, and with a huge potential for improvement. And even in the area of the timeliness of reporting, there is still a problem. We have 96 countries that publish data on a monthly basis. But as the crisis has shown, in many of the crisis countries, the reporting was only on a quarterly basis. And that has been one of the sources of the problems that we're going to talk about in a minute. I should mention that many of these statistical reporting standards call for quarterly general government fiscal reporting. But in our view, this has not been sufficient and led to some of these problems. Now, this is a beautiful table. I really love it a lot. I used it also in one of my TA reports to an Asian country. And it highlights a very striking development over just a 4-year period between 2007 and 2010. And we should maybe begin with the last line, which shows the total unforecast increase in debt, in general government debt, during this 4-year period. And you see France with an increase of 14.4%, and then the worst country in this group is Iceland with 67.7% of GDP just during a 4-year period. And these are the 10 countries that had the largest unexpected increase in general government debt during this period in question. Now, what we did in our board paper, we analyzed the determinants, the factors that led to this unexpected increase in general government debt. And if we look at the first category, the underlying fiscal position, which essentially represents the government's understanding or lack of understanding of the underlying fiscal position. And there have been revisions with respect to deficit or debt numbers. There have been changes to the government boundaries, for instance, as a result of SOEs and PPPs that needed to be taken on by governments, or the cash to accrual adjustments, which essentially represent arrears. And you can see, if you look in greater detail into some of the country cases, for instance, arrears was a major issue in the case of Iceland, whereas revisions to deficit and debt numbers was a major issue in the United States, 7.1% of GDP during the period. The second main determinant is related to the exogenous shocks, which essentially represents the situation that many countries had substantially underestimated the risk to their fiscal prospects resulting from either macroeconomic shocks or financial sector interventions. And as you can see in some cases, like Iceland or Ireland, Greece also, the extent of this underestimation is just enormous, between, let's say, 40 to 60% of GDP, to a large extent related to financial sector interventions. But also, if you look at Greece and Ireland, 38.4% and 35.7% related to the fall in GDP and output during the years. Even my own country, as you probably noticed, I'm from Germany, the financial sector interventions, 8% of GDP during a 4-year period, was unthinkable in the public debate in Germany. But the government had to take on these responsibilities, and that resulted in an increase, or contributed remarkably to an increase in general government debt in Germany. The last main factor is policy changes, and that could either be countries trying to stimulate the economy or to consolidate. The consolidators are Greece, Ireland, and Iceland because of their very difficult fiscal position, whereas other countries, notably the United States and some European countries, they try to stimulate economic activity. So all in all, within just 4 years, there has been this remarkable increase in general government debt. And if you look at the right-hand side, some of the issues that were revealed by the crisis, this is what we are going to focus on in our current work on enhancing the fiscal transparency code and our assessment framework. Now, we are now deepening the assessment of the numbers a little bit with the example of Portugal. And there you see the traditional concepts, essentially the blue bars, which shows the non-SOE and PPP general government debt. And there, at first glance, numbers seem to be not too alarming, still going up because of the difficult situation the country was in, but nevertheless, it doesn't look too alarming. But then if you look at 2007, the red area, this is when some SOEs and PPPs had to be taken on by the general government or by the government, and that has resulted then in an increase of the general government debt in Portugal. And that gives you the black solid line that goes up. But even though some of these SOEs and PPPs have been taken on board by the government, as you can see by the light gray bars, some of these SOEs and PPPs are still outside of the general government. And even more remarkable in my view is also that before 2000 or 2001, we didn't even have the information related to these SOEs and PPPs. So very clearly, there's a major issue in reporting. The last area to highlight is the arrears on top, and that is the number you saw on the previous table. So essentially, within a very short period of time, in the case of Portugal, the situation of general government debt has deteriorated remarkably. Now, the lessons from the crisis. This is kind of the analytical framework that we use. We analyze the problem, like the revisions to deficits, the quasi-fiscal activities by SOEs, unreported flows, macroeconomic shocks, exposure to the financial sector. We were looking at how the current standards may have contributed to this, because they may not have been stringent enough. For instance, with respect to the infrequent fiscal reporting, the focus on general government, or if you take the exposure to the financial sector with respect to the lack of recognition of contingent liabilities. And this leads to the right-hand column, to the recommendations, which is that we would think it would be opportune for countries to aim for monthly reporting of their fiscal deficits or fiscal situation. That they should also strive to move from the general government concept more and more to the public sector concept, and with respect to the financial sector, recognition of quantifiable contingent liabilities. Now, if we look at this slide, this is also related to the IMF's core surveillance mandate. We realized in the analysis that is presented in this board paper that in many countries there were developments in the public sector with respect to deficits, with respect to debt, that maybe we should have caught also, and we should have discussed with the country authorities in order to also come up with some sensible policy measures. So the revisions of the Fiscal Transparency Code that we are now undertaking is also part of our mandate to deliver good surveillance to our member countries. And as I mentioned earlier, we had 111 fiscal ROSCs, and these fiscal ROSCs, including to some countries that were highlighted in the table, apparently did not capture all of these risks that did exist. And so we clearly recognize the need to revise the Fiscal Transparency Code and also our assessment tool. We should also mention that the demand for these fiscal ROSCs, as shown in the last bullet point, has really gone down quite a bit. So we had also to fight with a demand side issue, 21 ROSCs in 2002 and only 1 in 2011. But even more fundamental were the weaknesses of the existing code and the ROSC with respect to some other features. For instance, the code and the ROSC, they evaluate clarity of reporting procedures, but not the quality of reports. So the code and the ROSC also adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to evaluate countries. They do not take into account different levels of institutional capacity. So the same procedures are being applied to low-income countries and to advanced economies. They don't provide milestones to countries to achieve full compliance with international standards, and they make it difficult to benchmark against comparator countries. And the ROSC assessments, they tended to be very exhaustive, a little bit boring, and when you read them, rather than risk-based. And they placed an equal weight on all elements of the code, even though some areas were much more important for a given country than other areas. So it was very difficult to judge the relative seriousness of different fiscal reporting gaps. And these reports also included usually a large number of recommendations that were not prioritized. So for our member countries, when they're confronted with all of these recommendations, it was sometimes difficult to digest what is really very important, what they need to tackle right away, and what could maybe wait a little bit longer. So this now led us to the revision of the Fiscal Transparency Code, and now Richard is going to take over, and he will lean on his Ireland experience in his presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Johannes. And so with that as the background and motivation for the revisions to the code, I wanted to take you through a sort of helicopter overview of the document that you've got in front of you, which is the current working draft of the Fiscal Transparency Code, as well as give you a flavor of how we've applied it in practice in a set of pilot countries which Johannes mentioned. I should also say that in addition to our own internal analysis, this work has also been informed by an initial public consultation which we did launch back in December, to which we got a number of responses from mostly civil society organizations, but also academics and a few others. And it's part of an ongoing consultation process in the sense that when we do go live with a revised version of the code, it will be once again for consultation and feedback from people. So this is only the first of many opportunities to feed in your thoughts. But I guess to give you a bit of a sense of how the kind of findings that Johannes highlighted about the lessons from the crisis and also experiences with the ROSCs in crisis countries has driven our revisions to the code and shaped the objectives for that revision, there were really 5 things that we had in mind in terms of what we wanted to achieve in revising the code. And the first was that we really wanted to place a much greater emphasis on the quality and reliability of published information rather than the quality of reporting procedures. So focus a lot more on the reports themselves and not as much as the old code did on the process involved in producing them, because countries can go through a very good process but not produce a very good output. And that was certainly one of the findings of our review of the ROSCs. The second was to update the individual principles and practices described in the code to reflect the lessons that Johannes highlighted about the coverage of statistics and the timeliness, etc. The third was that I think we're becoming increasingly conscious that movements in international accounting standards and statistical standards are increasingly outpacing low-capacity countries' ability to keep pace with them. And so one of the things we also wanted to do was to provide countries with a sort of set of milestones to get from where they are now toward best practice, and not just have a single one-size-fits-all best practice standard as the old code used to set out. A fourth was that one thing that's happened since we first promulgated the Fiscal Transparency Code is that there have been quite a lot of new and revised standards put out for aspects of fiscal reporting, from GFSM 2001 to IPSAS. And so we wanted to bring what we describe as being good practice in the fiscal transparency area into line with those standards. And where those standards themselves differentiate between a kind of basic level of practice and a good level of practice and a best level of practice, to try and align our categorization with those. I think PIFA is a very good example of something which already does that. And then the final thing we wanted to cater for is to allow a modular application of the code, so that you don't have to just buy a kind of whole ROSC if you want an assessment of a particular aspect of your fiscal transparency practices. And you'll see how we've tried to turn the code into a 3-pillar structure, which enables you to do just one pillar, or even do the pillars not so much in transparency mode, but internal management mode. So if you have a country which wants this information for their own management purposes, but at the moment is nervous about publishing it, they can at least have this assessment of the quality of the information they get for their own internal risk management practice. And to give you a sense of what the new architecture of the code looks like, we've gone from a structure which was much more focused around institutions and procedures to one which is really organized around 3 key dimensions of fiscal disclosure. Fiscal reporting, so reporting about the past in the form of statistics and accounting data. Fiscal forecasting and budgeting, so reporting about the future, which is the second pillar. And then finally, fiscal risk analysis, so reporting about all the uncertainties that you are likely to face as you move from the present into the future. So we've tried to look at transparency in 3 dimensions. Sort of understanding the past up until the present, having a clear and credible understanding of what the future looks like, and also having a clear understanding of what the risks around any point forecast you have for the future. And within each of those pillars, the new code sets out a set of principles and practices and indicators, which I'll describe in more detail in the subsequent slides. A second big sort of architectural innovation in the code, which we've alluded to already, is the fact that we want to set not just a single good practice standard, but a more differentiated standard, and a more differentiated set of practices under each of the key principles that goes into the code. And this just highlights for you, we've taken three principles from the code related to basically the coverage of fiscal reports, and shown you how it differentiates within the basic principle that reports should be comprehensive, both in terms of coverage of institutions, coverage of flows, and coverage of stocks. But to differentiate that into what is a sort of basic requirement, which is something which you could reasonably expect all IMF member countries to be able to do. So in the case of coverage of institutions, you'd at least want every IMF member to tell you what's going on within their central government, what's going on within the cash flows of central government. And in terms of stocks, at least report what their stock of cash and their stock of debt is. But also, for countries, but also not to stop by just setting basic requirements, but to also say, what is good practice in this area? So for countries with more developed human, institutional, and technological capacities, what level of transparency would you expect them to be able to get to? And that's the sort of philosophy behind what we describe as good practice. So, and where we would there say that the sort of ISA 95 expectations or GFSM expectations about producing general government fiscal data, covering not just cash flows but also some accrued revenues and expenses, as well as all financial assets and liabilities, is something which we think countries with higher levels of capacity can aspire to. But then finally, what we wanted to do was also sort of set out what the frontier is in terms of good international transparency practice, and also what is consistent with full compliance with relevant international reporting standards like IPSAS or GFS or ISA 2010, as it will be. And there you see that, as Johannes alluded to, what we want to see is more and more countries moving toward public sector reporting, incorporating all cash and accrued revenues and expenses, but also changes in the valuation of their assets, which get picked up in other economic flows. And then finally, we want to see countries producing full balance sheets, so not just their financial assets and liabilities, but also their non-financial assets as well. And so that's what we mean by when we say that we want a code that is more differentiated and provides a clearer set of milestones to get countries from where they are now toward full compliance with international standards. The other thing which we wanted to do was not just use the code as a way of identifying gaps that countries have between their practices and kind of best practice standards, but also get a sense of the magnitude of those gaps. And one of the criticisms that we got about the Fiscal Transparency Code, and I think one of the criticisms that we identified about the Fiscal Transparency ROSC, was that it was quite good at telling you, where you had a problem, but it didn't tell you how big the problem was. So it would tell you, look, you produce general government data, but it excludes your state-owned enterprise sector. But if your SOE sector is only 1% of GDP, so who cares? So one of the things which we've added as a complement to the code, and an important part of the fiscal transparency assessment, is a set of indicators which give you a sense of the materiality of deviations from best practice wherever those occur. So looking at how much revenue and expenditure is outside published fiscal reports, what kind of liabilities and assets are not being included in government balance sheets, to provide more of a motivation and more of a sense of prioritization to where we identify gaps and say they need to be addressed, kind of give the reasons why that's the case. And I'll show you how we've applied those indicators in practice to a country in the next slide. And obviously, the point of this code is partly to provide a statement of what the IMF thinks is good practice in the fiscal transparency area, but it also provides for us a framework for the new fiscal transparency assessment, which will replace the old fiscal transparency ROSC. And for that, what we want to get out of these new assessments is, as I pointed out, to kind of distinguish between more or less serious deficiencies in countries' transparency practices. Also, I think by comparison with the old ROSCs, allow countries to kind of compare and contrast themselves with their neighbours or countries at similar levels of development. It was very difficult with the old ROSCs to take a ROSC for Portugal and take a ROSC for Spain and actually tell how Portugal's doing against Spain, because there are a lot of words in there, and there's a lot of recognition of good work, but then a lot of talk about further work to be done. But it's very difficult to actually get a sense of kind of how does the coverage of Spain's fiscal reports compare to the coverage of Portugal's. So we wanted to make that a bit more transparent. I think it also be more transparent about when we say you are partially compliant with this principle, exactly what we mean by partially compliant. And then finally, when we come to making recommendations in these reports, we want to be clearer and more prioritized about the recommendations we make, and move away from both having sort of 20 recommendations at the end related to every single gap we've identified against the code, as well as providing a much clearer roadmap for how to get from where you are now to full compliance with the principles over a reasonable period of time. What this colourful chart shows you is when we've applied the fiscal transparency indicators in practice to a sample country, the kind of information that it allows you to show the authorities and allows you to show people who are interested in the quality of their fiscal reporting. I should say this is not drawn from any of the 3 countries where we're currently piloting the fiscal ROSC, and if you can guess which country this is, you might win some kind of IMF prize. But that's probably a dubious honour. But I think
a free ROSC.
Yeah, exactly. Well, come and look at your bank statements. But what it shows for this sample country is that the institutional coverage of their reports is not very good. It excludes about 20% of GDP in public sector fiscal activity because it only covers the central government budget, excludes quite a lot of extra budgetary activity, excludes the whole of their local government and all of their non-financial corporations, which were quite sizable. It also shows you that there's very limited reporting of assets and substantial underreporting of liabilities across the public sector. They basically only reported what was the central government's external debt, but nothing else. There were lots of assets and liabilities, particularly in the public corporation sector, that weren't being captured in fiscal reports. It also looks at the credibility of their fiscal forecasts. So the bottom left-hand chart shows you the average overspend against their budget over a period of 3 years, and shows you that they overspent their budget by 29% on average over that period. So the budget wasn't a very credible and transparent indicator of where their public finances were going. And it also shows you that there were really two sources of overspending against the budget. One being civil service wages, another basically fiscal problems in local governments and parastatal enterprises, so state-owned enterprises, which needed to be bailed out more or less on an annual basis by the central government, which was a further drain on the government finances. And then finally, on the lower right-hand side, it gives you a sense of what the very large contingent liabilities of the country are, both to the public and private sector, as well as to their own central bank. Which basically provides a motivation for why this country needs to look more closely at fiscal risk management as a big part of improving fiscal transparency. And the final point I made is that we wanted to give countries a rather more kind of impactful summary assessment of where they stood relative to both the absolute standards set by the Fiscal Transparency Code, but also, as we do more and more of these assessments across the world, allows countries to compare and contrast themselves with their neighbours and keep up with the Joneses. And so one of the things which having a more differentiated standard, which differentiates between basic, good and advanced practice, enables you to do, is to produce these kind of summary heat maps at the end of our report, which, if you don't want to read through all of the dull kind of language that IMF staff write in reports, you can just turn to the back page and get it all in one colourful picture, and which shows you kind of where the country is doing well, where it's doing not so well. And I think there's maybe a small prize for whoever can guess which country that was at the end of its fiscal transparency assessment. And so the final thing, which is a significant revision to the fiscal transparency ROSC and a new feature of the fiscal transparency assessment, is to provide not just a kind of long list of unprioritized recommendations at the end, but to try and actually provide countries with a fiscal transparency action plan. Which, for the areas where it is identified that it is a priority for reforms in the fiscal transparency area, tells them not just what they need to do, but what are a kind of credible series of steps which they can achieve, which they can do over a reasonable period of time, which we put at about 5 years, to get from where they are now toward compliance with good and even advanced practice in fiscal reporting. And this gives you an example of, for the country I mentioned before, which had big problems with activity outside the central government budget. Obviously what they want to do is expand the coverage of their fiscal reports, starting with extra budgetary funds so that they can get to both basic compliance with the coverage standard by 2015, then bringing in their local government sector, and then finally their public corporation sector to give them a comprehensive overview of the state of the public finances by 2017. And so it gives you a sense of a picture of both what the priorities are, the steps how to get there, and the fact that in any country, if you want to make progress on any of these kind of recommendations, it does take a significant amount of time and quite a lot of parallel effort in different aspects of fiscal reporting at different levels of government if you want to achieve the kind of ambitious standards that the code sets in terms of the advanced practices that it describes. So that's a sort of helicopter view of the code, as well as why we've gone about revising it, and also a sneak preview of how we've applied it in practice to some countries. And with that, we look forward to hearing the thoughts of our commentators, as well as all the thoughts that you have on the work we've done today.
Cool. First
Johannes and Richard, thank you very much indeed. A tremendous presentation, and this is clearly it's a very significant step forward. And I think the way now that the fund has updated the code, but also how you're sort of clarifying how you're using the code in terms of giving countries a very clear sense of where they are in relation to it, I think is a tremendous step forward. There's some complex issues which I think arise in terms of how the bank looks at these questions, because clearly our task isn't just to simply hold up the fiscal transparency code and say, well, you're not doing very well, so you need to do better. So in a sense, translating this to tactics in terms of country level interventions, I think, is a big challenge on the bank side. And there's also issues in terms of how we look at some of the implicit assumptions that are within the code. But we have two great commentators to help us start thinking some of these issues through. And any preferences as to have you arm wrestle as to who will go first? So Stuti, you'd win. So yes.
Thank you. I did prepare a few slides.
Is this sufficiently mobile? Or else, Richard, would you mind
I don't mind being the driver.
Thank you so
Let me
much.
just
But I must begin by saying, I prepared a few slides because I was asked specifically to talk about rigorous research style evidence. So I'll quickly go through those, but I must say I found the presentation absolutely excellent, and I've learned so much from just the 20 minutes you've done. So I have some thoughts immediately. I made 2 quick points, which I'll come to at the end, which I think are probably my most important thoughts, but we can just quickly go through this. So in terms of impact on what, if I'm going to put on my researcher, evidence producer hat, I don't think it really makes much sense to talk about impact in terms of this being a tool which is useful in its own right as a technical tool to enable better policy decisions or for external partners to make their fiscal and macroeconomic assessments. So really the key question that we seem to be grappling with in our institution is this an accountability tool, and how would it be used as an accountability tool to get governments to respond to citizens by improving the development impact of their spending programs. So on that, the evidence is really, really scant. Most of the evidence that as a researcher I would view as interpretable correlations that are credible results really focus not on fiscal or budget transparency, but on information interventions. The bulk of it is specifically in the area of community monitoring of service providers in health or education, and I'm a partner and producer of some of that type of evidence. And then there's a very exciting branch of research which is focusing on information interventions on individual politicians, legislative assembly members. But again, none of this is really about general fiscal or budget transparency. So I can count on one hand what I would call credible, interpretable evidence on fiscal that would qualify as evidence of fiscal and budget transparency. One is the famous PETs in Uganda, but really the problem there is that it was one quite small line item in the education budget. So again, what does it tell us about budget transparency as a whole? The second is another famous example of this initiative by the Brazilian government to audit municipalities and randomly disclose the results of those audits, with the focus being on corruption, how there were irregularities in how municipalities were using their funds. And there's evidence that that kind of exposure of corruption has had electoral effects. It's very sensitive to the timing of elections and to the presence of local media, such as radio, which can amplify the information about corruption. The third might be less well known here is, I don't even know whether it's published yet, but there's an experimental research in Mexico which provided citizens information about municipal budgets. And the big striking conclusion from that is it had the unexpected effect of discouraging citizens from showing up at the polls. Again, this work was also done around election. So not only did the vote shares of the incumbent government whose irregularities were reported decline, but also the vote shares of challengers, because people simply didn't want to go out and vote in a context where they don't like what their government is doing. Overall, none of this work, even the ones that have found some effects as in Brazil or in Uganda, there's no real evidence of sustainable impact in terms of long-term durable institutions of change. We can move to so one of the questions that I was told to address by the organizers is, where should we be investing in evidence, particularly as within the bank, I suppose. So here's a case can be made, I think, for particularly investing in local government budget transparency, and even in contexts with limited real decentralization in terms of giving discretion for intersectoral allocation to local governments. And why? Well, one immediate reason is local governments are increasingly becoming the frontline managers of basic services that citizens care about, that matter directly for concrete development outcomes. And here I'm reminded of a very colorful anecdote I was told about a taxi driver who told one of our regional vice presidents that, quote unquote, I can't eat growth. So putting out statistics, even such as growth, is not meaningful to people on the ground. So focusing on budget transparency in this context, where you can sort of link budget allocations to outcomes that people really care about, there might be some hope, some potential there, which is unexplored. Yes, next one, please. Thank you. And I think the research can be designed at this local level to answer very fundamental questions of incentives. When and how do citizens use transparency? What is the potential of existing local institutions for collective action to sort of amplify the transparency? And then ultimately, how do governments or politicians respond? Again, I don't think we have any evidence on these kinds of questions, but it's possible to generate it. It will require some investment in generating. Now, to end with the two questions I made, the two bullets I made notes on, one is just a quick, simple question. I'm really struck by that picture you showed about how wages are such a source of forecasting error. I mean, one would think that wages are the ones that the government can be sure about. How many people have they hired and what are they paying them? And so, what's going on there? The second is, so as you might have noticed, I've deliberately eschewed from mentioning any kind of cross-country regressions, because I think there are real hard problems of interpreting what cross-country correlations really mean, in terms of, if you correlate some indicators of budget transparency with outcomes, I really don't know what story that comes out of that. But as I was listening to you, and especially when I saw your slide on, the quick summary at the end about how do color-coded, how are countries doing, why not put, so don't think about impact of transparency, turn it around and put those indicators of the transparency on the left-hand side of a Economist-style regression, and let's try to understand when do countries have incentives to achieve which parts of this transparency. I think we would learn from that something about not just capacity constraints, but I think more importantly, at least from the type of hat I put on, what are the underlying political incentives that matter for? I mean, it's difficult to believe that all of this is just driven by capacity. So, if we put political institutions, so the underlying driving institutions of accountability on the right-hand side, can we get that to explain a little bit about how fast countries are moving and which particular indicators they are comfortable with checking off their list and which are really hard? I mean, I think a lot of people around here have experiential knowledge on that. It would be great to sort of put together large sample data on that. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks. Bob.
Well, it's interesting because I think Stuti and I are both operating under two different sets of constraints. They gave you very clear guidance as to what they wanted you to speak to. They opened it up for me but said no more than 5 minutes. I'm not sure what that says about either of us, but it's where we are. So 5 minutes, what I basically like to do is make 3.5 points. And you'll see there's some clear parallels in some of the points I'm making, what Stuti made. First of all, I really want to thank our colleagues, Johannes and Richard, for a very interesting and stimulating presentation, and also I think this effort's incredible. What's not to like? I mean, you're expanding, the scope of entities in the analysis. You're looking at different dynamics, whether it's assets, liabilities, contingent liabilities, whatever. You're doing it in ways that are much more interesting and colorful, differentiated, targeted. I mean, I'd love a picture that you put of your assessment for my wall. It was beautiful. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of good things going on there, and the question is not, is this a healthy constructive development? It obviously is. I think there's a lot to do. I think my questions are more collectively for all of us here at the bank, as well as the fund, to think about where we go with this. And some of this was very much predicated on Nick and Stuti's questions on the motivation and sort of the empirics of motivation. I mean, as a civil service expert, one of the things that is interesting about our discipline is it's been picked and prodded over with all sorts of assessments. And yet when it comes to transparency and openness in the bank, it's amazing the amount of momentum behind this now. The enthusiasm is far outstripping the empirics behind what we're doing and where we're going. And so this is an area where the empirics, I think, need to start catching up fairly quickly. Or we run a risk, as we often do, of pushing things that we all sincerely believe in that ultimately turn out to be fads. There's an intrinsic value in transparency. It's a value in addition to an empirically useful approach. But still, I think step number one, it seems to me, is to get the empirics going. And step number two, it seems to me, as we think about getting the empirics, there's part of this is the broader search for truth. But part of it is thinking very carefully about what motivates our clients to do this sort of thing. I think transparency reforms, one of the interesting things is oftentimes they're not particularly difficult to do. And there are examples of countries like Egypt that have moved up quite significantly in the open budget index in a relatively short period of time. Yet in spite of the fact that some of these reforms, certainly not all of them, if you're moving to accrual accounting, that's a challenge. But some of these reforms, putting budgets on the internet on a more timely basis, doing those things can be done relatively quickly. Yet it often, they aren't. And the reason, no surprise to anyone, is that oftentimes there are people who either are not enthusiastic about it or have something clear that they want to hide. State-owned enterprises from time to time with liabilities that are much larger than are officially recognized, things like that. And so how do we break this? I mean, how do we convince governments, when governments are weighing the benefits of transparency, to go ahead and take the plunge? And move forward along the various dimensions, and which of these dimensions are going to give them the greatest bang for the buck. I think this is an area where we're starting to see some interesting research. There's some research that shows the fiscal performance of transparent governments tends to be better on a number of dimensions than those that are less transparent. Interestingly, but this research is often more nuanced than we would necessarily like. The correlations are not direct. I mean, pre-2008, governments that were fiscally transparent and those that were not had relatively easy access to capital at attractive rates. Afterwards, that's gotten more complicated, but if you look at many developing countries, the price of their bond spreads historically has not varied all that much. Again, there's some recent issues, but has not varied all that much with regard to transparency. Other factors tend to play a major role. That's less clear in developing countries where it does appear that there's some evidence that transparency can have an important impact upon credit ratings and thus on the cost of capital. So I think as we move forward, it's going to be very important for us to look very carefully at how we can do the sort of research that can give us a very nuanced sense of what's happening with transparency and can give us concrete arguments that we can take to our counterparts that can convince them of the concrete benefits from moving to a more transparent environment that will help overcome some of the inherent resistance that needs to be done. The second issue, so that's sort of point number one. Point number two has to do with the framing behind this exercise, and I think it's more of a question for my bank colleagues than the fund, but it is interesting. I mean, one of the things that comes up with a lot of these reforms is that they seem to be very much targeted on addressing the risk of fiscal policy, macroeconomic stability, ensuring access to international capital markets, that sort of thing. The public accountability dimension of this is referenced. I mean, you address it. And there are some phrases to, ensuring that budgets are accessible to the public and understandable, but it feels relatively underdeveloped. And so if we do take the public accountability angle seriously, and this has parallels with Stuti's points, is there more to be done here? Is there more to be done collectively? I mean, what can we do in the bank, in the fund, and elsewhere to foster a more informed, sophisticated debate about the issues, contingent fiscal risks, and the like in country? I think that's going to be a quite big question for all of us as we move forward. And I guess my final question is, if we assume that generals are always fighting the last war, it's interesting to see the evolution, the fund's approach to fiscal transparency. I mean, starting in 1997 in response to the East Asian crisis, now it's being broadened and expanded in response to the 2008 crisis. I guess the challenge that all of us have is what's going to be the next crisis. What are the dogs that didn't bark? What are the aspects of Johannes's wonderful table on slide number 4? What isn't in the table? And is there going to be an opportunity for us, while we do this, to think a bit more about where the next generation of risk will come from, and if one can take useful steps to try to address those during this exercise as well. Thanks.
Well, Bob, thanks very much indeed, and also Stuti. Look, I think we're doing really well here in sort of moving from a very good presentation about the fund work in this area through towards a sort of broader discussion about how do we use this for development purposes, and particularly in the way that the bank does its business. And the way that I heard it, our commentators put sort of 5 points on the table. So forgive me for repackaging here, but the first point that I was hearing was that although within the tool and within the code, each element clearly is to do with government accountability, the tool overall is not about accountability. The tool is about the fund understanding where the weaknesses are. Right? The second point that I heard was that there's an interesting set of research questions about what drivers are likely to, very particularly political drivers, are likely to encourage or motivate governments to improve any of the elements. And which both from Stuti and also from Bob, I mean and certainly the question, I guess implicit question, is if fund disapproval isn't enough, then hard to imagine, right? But let's just say, right? Then a further set of issues that I think our commentators have put on the table, which was that underneath a very, and I mean this positively, a very slick presentation. I don't mean that in a sort of superficial sense. No, I think you've packaged it really well. Let's forget there are assumptions here, right? The assumptions are to do with the sort of the standards that you're measuring compliance with, and this point about how do we ever validate those assumptions. As the spreadsheets and the pie charts and the heat maps get glossier and glossier, they're not resting on absolutely incontrovertible facts. They're resting on some assumptions about what matters. How do we remember every now and again to look at those assumptions? And then the final question that I think our commentators put on the table was, well, what's missing? Right, there's something, right? The great step forward, but doubtless there are some things that haven't been covered. But if you don't mind, if we could just sort of open it up, sort of, for a round of comments or thoughts or questions on those, and then let's come back to you in a few moments. So, colleagues, please. Yeah. Yeah, I see behind me. How are you doing?
Hi, thank you. I have 2 questions and 1 comment. First question, we are working we have a working group in the bank to help countries with open data initiatives. And when we go and we try to give them the best examples of how should they present their data, and budget data is one of them, right? Have you been working with people that are trying to get some standards on reporting on fiscal, on budget data, like the Boost program here, I think that Massimo is there, and the open budgets group and so forth? That's the first question. The second question is, do you see the evolution of this reporting mechanism relying more on technology, in the sense that if government has a budget system, and God knows that the bank finances many of them, that budget system should have a reporting, it could have a direct connection to you guys, and every time that the reporting, that the budget system produces something new, you automatically will get the info, right? Or is that just science fiction? And my comment is on the impact of transparency on fiscal health. I don't doubt that your research produced 5 examples or less. You talked about impact in the rigorous way of having a control and a treatment group or somehow. But the converse cannot be said. I think that you would find plenty, IMF in its annals would find plenty of evidence of cases that fiscal crisis occurred because of lack of transparency.
I'm going to go around. I'm just going to sort of sweep around the room anti-clockwise and just sort of take comments or questions as we go this way. So please, yes, from behind.
Hi. I have 2 comments and 1 question. I think this is key. I was a public official in Colombia for 10 years. I was there when the economic recession hit and our fiscal numbers were a complete mess. So we had...
Sorry, it's a tough room. It's
okay, I'll speak higher. So we had to do a lot of the exercises you are proposing here, and being there, the anguish of seeing day by day everything deteriorated, and like kind of surprises coming from all the non-financial public sector, and not being able to understand how we got there. And then you start to make the projections, and then you say, okay, and how am I gonna get out of this? Because once you start to make a projection, sector by sector, taking into account accruals, all the information that was not there, it is a very anguishing experience. So I really think the fund targeting this multi-dimension problem, it's very important. And I always wondered back then, how could have we arrived to that situation, and what, when you are in a program with the IMF or when you are working with multilaterals, you assume you are kind of in good hands, and they are also kind of supporting your efforts. So it's a big surprise. So I think it's a recognition of the need to really target better how this is done, and I think it's key. I have another comment on slide 10 that deals with the 3 types of reporting and information. After we did all these exercises, fiscal exercises that we did in Colombia, we kind of became too transparent. And by too transparent, I mean markets were always, because we had contingent liabilities, we were reporting on all these things that might go wrong. So the markets and our spread kept being hit by that. And when we had conversations in the government, it was like, aren't we being too transparent, or aren't we competing with countries that are not so transparent, and what does that imply? I think that's a big thing. On the long run, I think it was very useful, and Colombia's spread is very low right now, but it was the transition period is very hard, and it's very difficult to tell your Minister of Finance or your President, it's good to be transparent even if markets don't think it's so good. So I think there's an issue there. And the question I have is in relation to slide 11, when you have the 3 basic good and advanced practices and the fiscal reporting. Do you have more or less a sense of how many countries are in which box right now? And how much will it take to go to best practices in all of them?
Thanks. I'm going to complete this round before we come back. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, at the back first, please. Yeah.
Rui Monteiro from the World Bank Institute. We published a few days ago a report on something that was referred before, the link between what government is spending and what government is supposed to provide to the citizens as public service. But we are now moving from this, let's say, ex post activity, disclosure after the contracts are signed, to ex ante, because we are concerned with the quality, first the quality of projects, second the quality of the contracts for PPPs. PPPs were referred here several times, and they are referred also in the working draft. And it's not just a matter of contingent liabilities, it's also a matter of direct commitments that are not reported in the accounts of government. Before joining the World Bank, I was for 11 years advisor to the Treasury Secretary in Portugal, the country that was extensively referred here. And I started.
We can see when you left.
No, you can see where I started. 2001 with the first large contract. Yes, and 3 years later, the government was quite concerned with lack of budgeting for PPPs, and there was a change. And there was a provision saying that not the budget, but the budget report should disclose all the costs of those PPPs. That was really not enough. We need to go further. We need to have that into the budget, because if it is not considered as public debt, no one will care. So I'm concerned with creating conditions for a fair appraisals of these infrastructure projects as PPPs or not PPPs. And second, creating, that involves having them in the budget, but also creating conditions for the budget not just to be transparent, but to be real for the quality of the budget. Because in many cases, public infrastructure projects are under budgeted, and that's why later they have cost overruns. So we need to create more, not just more visibility, but quality. And I'm sure that more visibility will force more quality.
Okay, just a few very brief questions so we don't sort of forget what some of the first ones were. Yeah.
Yes, very briefly. From the operational point of view, this proposed move from the processes to focus on the content, it's virtually a paradigm shift, and it will significantly change the quality of outputs. It potentially could improve our standing and credibility with our clients who are as focused on the content and data as on the processes, and it will really enhance and expand the quality of dialogue. A few comments. As you are going to make this change, I think that finding the right mix of skills is critical, because you're now venturing into much more technical area than before. You yourself mentioned that multiple standards, multiple accounting financial reporting standards which are being used around the world, it's a question. And on top of the standards that you have mentioned, some of the countries like New Zealand, they have developed their own standards. So if you want to provide the quality advice for these countries, you have to find the way to bring this into picture, and you have to find people who would be able to intelligently discuss this. And the final comment is that if one of the ultimate objectives of this analysis is to actually see whether the public funds are being used in the best possible manner and the quality of budget execution is as it should be, probably it would be good to somehow bring the public procurement into picture. Because what you probably will see as you start this analysis is that some of the deficiencies can be attributed to the classification issues, so purely accounting methodology, but then there will be deficiency of the process and misuse of resources. That's it.
Thanks. Please. Yeah.
I wonder how, I mean, you mentioned the need of assessing the quality of the information that is reported by countries. So I would like to ask you if what do you have in mind on how are you gonna really assess the quality of this information that many times is not accurate, to say in a political correct way. Second, like one of the things that I wonder is if you are going to incorporate in these new versions of the fiscal reports that differentiated levels of transparency across levels of government. I mean, it can be the case that federal government it's a little bit transparent, but not at the subnational level. And within the government, also there is a problem, like, and it's related to the motivations that one of the commentators mentioned in her presentation. That is, like, why is it the case that countries will decide to be transparent, for example, in information of state-owned enterprises? Many times is used the argument of national security to say, no, I'm not going to report, in the case of oil companies, for example, that are state-owned, why I'm going to report to the world what are my reserves? I mean, what are the political motivations? Is it only because the fund is going to come and condition it alone on me? Not really. So in that sense, if you are thinking on in re-engineering these reports, how are you going to take seriously the political economy considerations of fiscal transparency in your design?
Okay, thanks very much indeed. I think, can I think you're on the second round? Do you mind? Sure. Yeah, thanks. I think that's we've given you quite a thicket of questions that you can hide within. So the chances that we'll actually, although I have taken notes, so we'll try to see whether you miss any out. So feel free to duck and dive within them.
So maybe I start. And given that you're filming all of this, I'm not going to give you any prediction on the next crisis, what's going to come. But I take your point that things may change. Things may also change very rapidly. As I said in the presentation, if you take the case of Germany, nobody thought that the financial sector bailout would be necessary, and that also it would account or be equivalent to 8% of GDP. So this is really something that's is unfortunately evolving or developing in the world outside, and we will have to adjust our work and and our tools. And if you look at how the Fiscal Transparency Code was designed, after 5 years or so, we had to revise the code because also of what was happening in the real world. I also want to give the example of the PIFA. Also there, the PIFA was kind of inaugurated in 2005. 300 assessments have been done to date, but also there, the PIFA steering committee has launched an effort in order to look at the PIFA framework and kind of to adapt it to what has been happening in the real world. And so I think all of us, the IMF, the World Bank, the PIFA partners, developing partners, governments, we just cannot operate in a vacuum and we come up with one Bible that will be valid forever and ever, but we will have to make adjustments and react to the real world. So what we are doing here, it is probably fair to predict that in a few years' time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, we will have to go back to the drawing board and make further adjustments to it, because there will be new developments in the real world. You will be retired by then, right? With respect to this tension that you perceive between macroeconomic stability and accountability, I don't think there's a tension, and I actually think that the tool can serve both purposes. Of course, we are from the IMF, and our focus is always on macroeconomic stability, and informing. The tool is also intended to inform our policy advice to the member country. But as Stuti also said, it is very important that the tool can also be used in order to improve decision making by policymakers. If policymakers are made aware of some of the deficiencies and the problems in their setup of fiscal policy, for instance, the risks that they are not aware of in the financial sector, or their susceptibility to macroeconomic exogenous shocks from outside, I think this is a valuable contribution to the policymakers that will help achieve macroeconomic stability, but also I think it can help enhance accountability toward the electorate, toward the public in a given country. And it is also with respect to this angle that our board paper was called Fiscal Transparency, Accountability and Risk. So we tried to really emphasize the accountability aspect, and it is our intention also to have these ROSCs published. If the member countries agree to that these ROSCs will be published, they should be published. We know of one country already that went through the process, that they're willing to publish it, but at the same time they also want to publish their action plan that is related to the deficiencies that were identified, and they want to tell their public how they're going to achieve a better world, meaning less red and less orange in the heat map. So I think this is very important. I think also another aspect that we want to emphasize is the modular approach. Each country has a different comfort level. If you go to, for instance, our first two pilot countries, they were very much at ease with us doing this exercise. I could think of more than a handful of countries where the comfort level is probably much, much worse, and where publication is not in the cards. But nevertheless, if we can engage with a country, maybe just doing one of the modules instead of all of them, and maybe an assessment of their risk management tools, that will ultimately, hopefully, also be helpful, first of all, in maintaining macroeconomic stability, but hopefully down the road also in addressing the accountability concerns. Also, with respect to another point Stuti made on local governments, I think this is very important that we bring this into the pictures. The focus on many of these standards and also in our work has been on the central government, and we need to make sure that local governments are brought more into the picture. And then we shouldn't be satisfied with this. We should also focus on the state-owned enterprises and the PPPs, because they were one of the sources of the problems during the last crisis. And if we can enhance transparency on their operations and bring them also in the picture with respect to fiscal reporting, I think it would be a major achievement. Now, you mentioned the point of how do we convince governments that SOE data should be published, and it's an extremely valid point, and I'm sure we will encounter difficulties in the process of doing these assessments. But I think we can also present some evidence from our own work or from the work that was done by others that if you don't look at SOEs and PPPs, you may end up in a situation like, let's say, Portugal, for instance, or some of the other countries. And the same holds also true for looking at some of the tools that you have in place. You just need to think in broader terms, and the best arguments we can have, I think, is that we present evidence from other countries. Now, how do we get there? I think also in the case of Colombia, you raised this issue, and I think our intention is that we want to illustrate to the country, first of all, where they are at, and this is the heat map that we want to provide to the country. But then, as Richard also pointed out in the presentation, we want to show them kind of an action plan, a prioritized action plan, in which we can show them how we can show them to get to maybe from the basic practice to good practice, or even to the advanced practice. And very often the reforms that are necessary will be very challenging reforms, and this is where technical assistance, capacity building will be very important, so we need to link it to our capacity building efforts. And it is not just the IMF, but it's especially also the World Bank, it is other development partners that also need to become involved, and the new skills that are needed. For instance, if you think about accrual accounting, if a country moves to accrual accounting, it's a completely new world for a country. And so it is extremely challenging, and you cannot do it from 2014 to 2050. You need to build the capacity, and this is where the partners have to help. Finally, on the basic good and advanced practices, I can't remember the exact question, but I think what we need to highlight is that the standards as we have defined them, some of these include judgment on our side. We are relying to a large extent on existing codes, our existing standards, but in some areas we had to kind of venture into a new world and come up with our own standards based on our judgment. This is an area where maybe we also need to still be on the drawing board, and we would also value your feedback in this particular exercise, because once we have codified it, once we have set up the framework, it will be in place for, let's say, 5 or 10 years. And so now is really also the time, if you have any specific observations of where we may want to rethink our approach, this is the time now to raise these issues. Finally, my very last point is on wages, the forecasting error. I've worked on a country recently where also the forecasting error with respect to wages was particularly large. And this was because there was a large forecasting error with respect to the revenue side. And then the country, during the course of the fiscal year, realized, oh, we have more revenue, so what do we do with it? And then we just distributed to the civil servants in the form of bonuses. So this was a country that's where we experimented with the model. They should do it here, the bank and the fund. But this was the motivation in that particular country, and maybe Richard, you're aware of more cases like this. But sometimes it can be as simple as that.
I think Johannes has done all the tough questions, so I can just take the easy ones. I think on the question about sort of where is the evidence, I think we sort of, where is the evidence that fiscal transparency matters? I think we and you look at the issue from rather different perspectives, but I think from the same position, which is that we want fiscal transparency to affect fiscal sort of outcomes, be they outcomes for individuals or outcomes for economies as a whole, but we're struggling to find it in the data, and we've been struggling quite hard at it. And I think unlike you, we look at it from the macro side, and the kind of regressions that you hate, where there's one set of variables on the left-hand side and another on the right-hand side, and 50 million controls in between. But I think one of the things which we did find in the paper we did was there is a correlation between transparency and performance. It's not perfect, it's not great, and there are better correlations with other things, but it does seem to matter. And I think in particular the point that Bob made is that it's really shown up after 2008 and after the crisis hit, in that what was clear before the crisis is, particularly in the case of advanced countries, because to some extent low income and developing countries have always had to be more transparent if they want to borrow, whereas markets basically got lazy in the case of the OECD, and in particular in the case of the Eurozone, and they didn't differentiate between those countries who were being completely transparent about their fiscal situation and those countries that weren't. And that relates to some of the governance aspects of the Eurozone and what was expected of the ECB, and what ultimately came to pass when some of those countries got into trouble. But certainly what you saw after 2008 was a very big differentiation in what markets' expectations of default between transparent countries and untransparent countries. And so one of the things you have to recognize is that when people don't care about transparency, it doesn't show up in the numbers. When it suddenly starts to matter, it suddenly starts showing up in the numbers too. So I think from the macro side, we're increasingly confident that transparency matters for fiscal performance. And certainly our anecdotal evidence in working in a lot of these countries is that we basically have the same experience that you had in Colombia, which is that when you're not transparent and you don't have good and frequent data coming into ministries of finance, you are making fiscal policy on shifting sands, and it becomes incredibly difficult to set targets and meet them and demonstrate a track record of performance when you're constantly being shocked by reclassifications of SOEs and PPPs and undiscovered deficits and everything else. On the question of what drives change, I think it's a very good question, and there are a few virtuous governments out there, like the ones that approached us to be pilots for these assessments. And we've been consistently surprised up until now how many countries want to go through this. Maybe once they see what the final outcome looks like, they'll be less enthusiastic about their heat map. But one of the things which we saw made a big difference when we looked at those trends that Johannes was showing about improvements in the coverage of data and everything else was what a big difference regional institutions made, and actually Europe, basically. That there was a huge push in Europe to get countries to all produce general government fiscal data, report your deficit and debt on a quarterly basis, and start producing some kind of balance sheet information. And that made that made a kind of paradigm shift, as somebody pointed out, in fiscal reporting in Europe. Now, a lot of countries did it well and in good faith. Some countries didn't, but there's no doubt that pressure from a regional organization which cares about fiscal surveillance makes a big difference. And that's why the kind of CMACs and WIMUs are probably the kind of institutions which can make a big difference in their parts of the world. On the point raised about open data, I think again this comes down to there are two equally valid and I think complementary views about what is transparency and what we want to promote. I think from the fund we take a very kind of necessarily top-down kind of macro view of transparency, and because of the nature of our work and the fact that we don't have many people on the ground in countries, the kind of work that we can do on fiscal transparency is about looking at their reports, giving them some advice, suggesting how to improve their macro numbers. We don't have the resources to do the kind of bottom-up improving individual personal accountability type work, but it is equally important. I think the best we can do in terms of these kind of assessments is to identify a set of proxies for what is transparency and accountability, and use those as a way of judging how transparent the country is as a whole. So all of the things which we look at here and all the indicators we judge are really proxies for good practice rather than measuring good practice itself, because good practice is diffuse, good practice is hard to observe. All you can do is look at the reports and say, this looks good enough to me based on what I know about the known unknowns. There's this stuff outside. One of the things which is difficult for us to do because of our own limitations is look a lot at the volume information being produced, as well as the extent to which governments are going through the kind of participatory budgeting type practices, which unless you're sitting at the table and observing the process, it's very difficult to know whether they're doing it right or wrong. And then I guess in terms of a stab at Bob's question about what's the next crisis going to be, I don't know either, but the one thing that one indication of what the next don't worry, I'm not actually going to answer the question, but I think one way of trying to guess what the answer to the question is take a look at what number governments are currently targeting at the moment in terms of their overall fiscal objectives, and then think about how you would get around that. Because one of the things which really struck us is that this crisis that we've seen recently has been to some extent created by the fact that governments were in Europe were targeting a particular definition of the deficit and debt. And one of the things which got them into trouble was that it created a huge incentive to then move fiscal activity outside that definition. And so I think if you want to predict the next crisis, look at what every government now says that they're targeting, and then think if you wanted to get to that number without putting in the hard work of getting into that number, what would you do to get around it? And then you might be able to predict the next crisis, and everyone will buy your investment newsletter and you don't have to work here anymore.
Johannes, Richard, thanks very much indeed for that, those very thoughtful comments. And actually your point about Goodhart's law, in effect, I mean, it's very, there's this point that whatever the number that you target, then ultimately the gaming will always defeat you. As soon as you put weight on a number, then it starts to beat you. Then it'll be something else. I mean, it suggests obviously that there's the long-term evolution of this. And actually, just at this stage, before I do for another round, just let me note, by the way, that in the development of this this work on the fund side, and then in this type of discussion, then I mean you have been tremendously transparent yourselves in the way you've approached that. So we really do want to acknowledge that. Thanks very much indeed. Ivor, you had a question you wanted to
a couple of points. I'm picking up on the discussion that you've just been having about creative accounting by government, and how this work, how you see this work, which seems to be breaking some new ground in terms of what you're actually looking at, will flow through, how you see that flowing through into actual international standards, international public sector accounting standards, because that would give some kind of firm benchmarks for governments to work towards. The second question was about whether you see any of these issues that you raise actually being picked up in fund programs, whether you're going to expand the scope of those to pick up on some of these issues. Right.
Any other yes, please. Yeah. Let's be brief because then this will be
Sure.
the final round.
Well, first question was actually what was raised over here, which I don't think was responded to in terms of how do you get at the accuracy of the data that's in all these reports, and the other is I think on the scope of the ROSCs. We saw when we went from CFAAs, well, at least in financial management, we saw it as an evolution from CFAAs to PIFA as really a big mindset change, going from what are the institutional inputs to what are essentially the outputs and what are the results in public financial management. This focus of the ROS seems to be a little bit in that direction, but mainly on the quality of or some of the things that you mentioned here in terms of timeliness, comprehensiveness. Basically, is the reporting good to the extent that you can see, and so I think keeping that focused is important. And some of the things I see seem to be going a little bit on the institutional side. The audit report published by the Supreme Audit Institution, that's an institutional issue. Why does it have to be by the SAI? It could be published by someone else. Some of it goes in the direction of policy, macroeconomic policy. There should be a legal limit on subnational borrowing. Doesn't seem to relate to the main principles here. So I think keeping it as focused on the main principles as possible would help a lot.
Just on that, actually, let me just quickly sort of speak for Phil that PIFA have got a very nice list where they've classified the PIFA indicators as either sort of metrics of institutional form or of performance, and for whatever historical reasons, it's quite an interesting sort of blend of the two. These things are very hard to simply put all your eggs in sort of one particular basket. But anyway, please do comment on these last two questions.
Maybe starting with the question on whether any of these findings would be picked up in IMF programs. You never know what our IMF mission chiefs are going to do, but it's clearly not the motivation of this exercise. It is mainly intended to provide information that could feed into the IMF's policy advice to the member countries. So it's more targeted at kind of the surveillance aspect of our work and less on program conditionality. And I think you would also risk a little bit the incentive structure of why a country would undergo such a ROSC, such an assessment, if the country knows it will end up in conditionality. So our hope or our intention at this stage is that the focus should really be to inform our discussions with the member country and also help the member country in improving its fiscal reporting. Now, at the same time, the question on the accuracy of the data, it's a very, very valid point. If you look at how the principles in this printout that was distributed are formulated, there's a lot of emphasis on the publication of data. So it is not just producing some data for IMF missions or anything like that, but the bar is actually pretty high, and you would only get the beautiful green color if really you're publishing the information. And there, the expectation is also that by publishing it, it is much more difficult for the country authorities to fudge with the numbers, because ultimately they are then responsible to their electorates and to their public. So that is the motivation, and the word published is in here quite frequently, and we had a lot of debates also within our teams whether do we really need published information. But in the end we said yes, we need published information, because then it is much more difficult for governments to hide things.
Richard, we're at our time limit, so please, the last word
Sure.
more or less goes to you.
Oh, I think just to put on, is this going to stop the next round of creative accounting, which I think was behind Ivor's question. I think we've tried to do our best to encapsulate, especially in the fiscal risk pillar, all the bits of creative things that governments have done over the last few years to try and get around fiscal accountability and transparency. But one of our thoughts about the fiscal risk pillar is it might need to be something which you add things to over time as countries get more and more creative. So it's an area where we're conscious that we will no doubt have to update this thing at one point, and we might want to make that an institutional part of this thing. The way that kind of tax authorities have to keep ahead of the tax avoiders, we have to keep ahead of the deficit avoiders.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks very much indeed. I mean, if I can just sort of throw in a sort of a passing observation at the end that the as Johannes rather cruelly noted, I mean, I'll be euthanized long before this sort of debate unfolds. But I mean, in a sense, there is an agenda here where further collaboration would be really useful on this question of, Richard, it was a very elegant dance on the correlation causation precipice, right, in terms of fiscal transparency and development outcomes. But I mean, we're less likely to have to do that dance if we disaggregate this and look at, like, what do we know about types of transparency and types of situations. And it's maybe less of an issue for you, but it's not a non-issue, and it's certainly a huge issue for us. How do we unpack this to get a more operational bite out of it? And maybe that's something that we might sort of see if there are opportunities to collaborate on. But I really do want to thank you both very much indeed. I mean, a tremendous presentation. I mean, a tremendous way in which you very openly responded to that whole range of questions and thoughts. So thanks very much. Absolutely. Yeah.